So Alisa is going to talk about test harnesses today. And let's give her a warm welcome with our applause.
Good morning, everybody. Well, following Simona is going to be a really tough act, I will say. So I'm going to have to talk about everybody's second favorite topic, which is testing. The first being security, of course, right? All right, so this might be a familiar tale for you. Let's say that you're a fan of K-dramas, and you work on a K-drama fan site. On this fan site, you can navigate to an individual K-drama to add comments. Now, this commenting system is pretty standard as far as commenting systems go, meaning that when you add a comment, a submit button enables. But when you think about testing this component, it can start to feel really overwhelming, because not only do you have to worry about how to test components within Angular, but you also have to worry about the testing framework that you might be using and any intricacies involved with that, as well as because we have UI elements here, you have to worry about the HTML API and the specific handling of each one of those elements. All in all, it could feel really frustrating and overwhelming. And if I had to describe automated UI testing in one word, I'd call it fussy. So let's make this a better process. I'm Alisa Duncan. I'm a senior developer advocate at Okta in Angular GDE, and yeah, I'm a K-drama fan. You can find me on the socials at Alisa Duncan. So today we're going to talk about testing the UI interactivity within an Angular application using a unit testing library. And we're going to focus on Karma to boot. That's because we can get that out of the box when we scaffold an Angular application, and we could really streamline this talk to focus on test harnesses and not any of the intricacies of the testing framework. But don't worry, all the concepts we will cover will be applicable to all forms of testing. There might just be a little bit of tweaks that you have to make, and I'll try to call those out when we come across it. And because we're going to jump right into using test harnesses when inside unit tests, I'll have an expectation that you have written unit tests in Angular before, meaning that you have set up a test bed, that you've interacted with the elements on that component, and that you've asserted on them. Just at that level, once again, focusing on the value of test harnesses. Now, I mentioned test harnesses just a few times, even in that last slide, but never defined what it is. So a test harness encapsulates the implementation details of an HTML fragment, those are components in our world, into an API for the sole purposes of testing. Now, this is pretty cool when you think about it, because we're taking encapsulation and object-oriented programming concept, bringing it into the front end, and bringing it into testing the front end. Now I think we're getting to pick and choose all the best parts of programming languages and bringing it into what works for us. When we do this, we're able to have this encapsulation layer around the HTML API, so which means we don't have to dig around in that anymore. And if we were going to assign some blame to the fussiness of automated UI testing, that HTML API might take its lion's share. When we use test harnesses, what it means is that we get to ignore the inner workings of any of those encapsulated components, which means that we'll have tests that are easier to read and write with less maintenance. Now, at this point, we're at ideal level of writing tests, right? Who doesn't want this? And we are in luck, because we can see how this works right out of the box when we use Angular material components, because all Angular material components have test harnesses built into them for each one of their controls, and it's fully available starting in Angular v12. So if you are using Angular v12 or higher, and using Angular material components, and you haven't used test harnesses yet, you're gonna wanna do so. Because the new MDC changes that came out in Angular v15 might mean your old tests need updates. Now, this is a separate schematic update, so it's not like you'll just get this right out of the box whenever you upgrade to v15. But I would suggest that as somebody who has just recently updated a v14 app to v15 app, I did run into some problems. I had some tests that broke that didn't use test harnesses, but all of my tests that had harnesses had no problems. So if you haven't used test harnesses yet and you're planning on taking that MDC update, first upgrade your tests to use test harnesses before you take that update, and you'll have smooth sailing. So let's see what these test harnesses look like in action within the scope of a test. If we go back to our K-drama fan site, we can log in and take us to the profile settings. Now, this profiles page has a newsletter sign up that's using Angular material controls. We have an input for the email, and we have this fancy on-off switch to subscribe. So if we take a look at the component template for that, we see those two fields. Oh, and if you haven't used Angular material before, everything has a map prefix. Otherwise, it should be named pretty similarly. So we have that input for the email, and then we have that fancy on-off switch, which is called a mat slide toggle. So if we first interact with that input element, and we'll do this without any test harnesses, it might look like this. First, you're going to need to get that input element. You'll probably do so by querying by a CSS selector, such as input. You can also use the directive mat input here. It doesn't matter. Once you have that input element, in order to interact with it, you need to access the HTML API, which is available through the native element property. That native element property has properties such as value to set the email, as well as a way to dispatch the input event, which is required to register that value into the control. But we're not done yet because you have to register this change within Angular too. So you have to run detect changes, wait for the fixture to stabilize before you can even start writing your tests. At this point, we've just interacted with that input element. So we had a lot of steps involved, and we had to deal with that HTML API multiple times to do so. On the other hand, interacting with a harness for this input control is much more straightforward. We're going to follow the same sequence order so you can see what this looks like side by side. What we'll do is to get the harness around the mat input control, which is called a mat input harness. Don't worry about the syntax. Loader.get harness yet. I'll talk about what that is here in a little bit. But once you have that mat input harness, it has API methods available to set the value. And this is all you have to do for the same amount of work that we just did earlier. And if you've used third-party UI control libraries, you might find that identifying selectors can be pretty painful. Let's talk about that slide toggle. Let's say you want to interact with that slide toggle. You might be tempted to query by the selector mat slide toggle. Unfortunately, this isn't the interactive element of the slide toggle. Under the covers, it's a stylized button. And that's what you'd have to work with to toggle it on and off or interact with it. But you wouldn't know that it's a button unless you dug around into the implementation or inspected it in DevTools, which you shouldn't have to do for a test. Because what if something changes, right? You might feel like, well, I'll use a DOM element instead of a CSS class name because it might be safer. But sometimes we don't have a choice. We have to use a CSS class name when we're trying to find some of these elements to test. Unfortunately, with the MDC changes, there's been more changes than just the CSS class names, right? The DOM element in this case also changed. It was a highly stylized checkbox. So if you were making an assumption that you were going to be testing against a checkbox, it is now a button, and this is one way where your test might be broken. On the other hand, using selectors or using test harnesses or selectors much more straightforward, but you just ask for the harness that you want to work with. So as you can see, when you're using test harnesses, you'll have tests that are easier to read and write, with more stability, more resiliency, less prone to breakage. And it'll allow you to get right to the parts that matter in your test, which is testing the behaviors that we want, not worrying about how to set up a test and how to interact with the elements. The underpinnings of all these test harnesses is built upon the CDK testing API, and it is what supports testing interactions with components. Let's look through how this works by setting up the test bed. We'll start with getting the harness loader. The harness loader is what we'll use to locate and get harnesses within the scope of our test. To create the harness loader, you'll create a component fixture and then pass that component fixture into the static method testbedHarnessEnvironment.loader. The testbed harness environment has other methods as well that you could use depending on if you have like a dialog within your component or not. But in our case, this loader method works. Once you have that harness environment, though, that testbed harness environment, though, is a specific instance of a harness environment that is unique for unit testing with Karma, and it's what's available out of the box from the testing API. If you are not using unit testing with Karma, or if you're using EDE tests with a different framework instead, you're going to have a different harness environment instance that works for your unique needs. Now, in our case, we're unit testing with Karma, so we can move on. That harness loader, once you've created that, it has different ways that you can locate and get harnesses. including the ability to make a child loader. This is particularly helpful if you want to focus that location of the search within a particular subsection of your component. Let's say that you have a nav section within your component with a whole bunch of links. You can create a child loader just for that nav section if you'd like. Now, I'll walk through each one of these methods in more detail. So you can get an individual harness by calling loader.getHarness and passing in the type of harness you want to work with. This is going to return the very first mat input harness it comes across in the template, or it's going to reject the promise. You can also call getHarness or null to return null instead of rejecting the promise, and get all harnesses to get with the particular type you want to work with. You can also create that child loader by passing in a particular selector, and then you can get harnesses like we just talked about. Additionally, you can filter for a harness, which is particularly helpful in that example with the nav section with the links if you just want to get the profile link as an example. Because you would just pass that in as an option for when you are locating the harness. But those options do depend on the type of harness you are working with. So the way you would filter for a button shouldn't match the way you're filtering for an input. The mat input harness, for example, has the ability to filter by value and by placeholder, and you could pass in a string or a regex. So if we wanted to walk through what this looks like in practice, we can get all harnesses with a particular value, such as only cool comments, please, by passing that in the call to get a harness. But once you have a harness, such as that mat input harness, it is up to the API of the harness on any subsequent interactions you can take, which makes sense because the way you'd interact with a button shouldn't match the way that you interact with an input element, for example. But don't worry, even though we're digging around into the code and looking at things under the covers, it's all documented, so you don't have to do that. You can just go to material.angular.io, look at the particular control that you want to work with, and find the API documentation there. And it's the same for all those filtering capabilities as well. But we're going to take a peek under the covers. So you can take a look at the mat input harness, for example, and see that it has methods that's really very applicable to all HTML elements, such as is disabled, is required, but it also has API methods that's more specific for an input control, such as get value, get name, and set value. And it all extends from the base class component harness. This base class component harness has a method host that returns the root element, which is similar to the native element property we just looked at earlier. It's the HTML API in essence. But it doesn't return that directly. It returns a standardized interface called test element instead, which is better because it allows for more scaling. This test element has methods such as blur, clear, click, focus, all the things you'd expect to deal with when you're working with UI elements. But notice everything they're working with is async. That's so that it handles the latest state on the control, and it handles the change detection for us, so we don't have to. And because we're working with so many asynchronous methods, the CDK library has this handy helper method called parallel that we could use that allows us to pass in multiple asynchronous calls and in one fell swoop, get the output of that to work with it. All right, so with that whirlwind introduction into using Angular material component test harnesses, we can win even more because we can write custom component test harnesses and have maximum winning. And you want to do this anytime you have any shared components within your application so that it makes it easier for the consumers of that shared component to have tests around themselves. So let's walk through what this looks like at a really high level so you can see what it looks like. If we go back to our K-drama fan site, this time we'll look at that commenting component. This commenting component is written using just straight up HTML elements. So there's no third-party libraries involved in here, just so we can look at this in its purest raw form. So we take a look at the component snippet. Of note, we have the selector, which is app add comment. And then in the template, we have the input control. We should also have that button, but we're going to focus on just this one element for right now, just so we can kind of keep things really kind of streamlined. But you'll see how it extrapolates out to other elements on your component. First, we're going to define the filters to support querying. So we're going to create an interface called add comment harness filters. We're going to follow the same naming conventions that Angular material already uses, just so we can keep things consistent. And then we're going to extend from the base harness filters. Next, we need to define how we want to filter for this commenting component, in which filtering for comment makes sense. So we'll add that. There might be other ways you want to filter later, but for now, we'll keep it at this one. Next, we'll implement this test harness. So we're going to create a class, add ComponentHarness, and then extend off the base class ComponentHarness. And then we need to define the host selector. This host selector should match the component for which you're writing this test harness for. So this is so that that harness loader can find this test harness. And so we're going to make sure that it's labeled the same, which is app add comment. Now we want to get the elements that's on this component. We can use the base class's locator for method and pass in a CSS selector, such as input. This will return that test element, which is like that wrapper around the HTML API, but it's not going to return that directly. It's going to return a function that returns that test element. This is so we always have the latest state on this control. And if you had any other elements, you would add it here as well. Next, we want to think about the API methods that we'd use to interacting with this commenting component, in which getting a comment seems to make sense. To implement that, we want to get that input element, and then we can work with the test elements methods, such as getting the value property. And then we'll do the same thing for adding a comment too. Sort of same operations of getting that element and then making the series of methods call that we need to set that value. Next, let's bring in that filtering that we had written earlier by creating a static method with, once again, we're going to follow the same naming conventions. This static method should return a harness predicate. So we'll have to create a new harness predicate and then add the options that we want to allow the filtering on, which is comment, and then implement that predicate by doing the string match. So once we have this, our implementation for a component harness is almost done. There's one more step. You have to test that test harness you just wrote, which seems kind of weird as you're testing a test harness, but trust me, you'll want to do so because you want to treat it like you're publishing an API. This is what your consumers of your test harness are going to use and that component are going to use to make sure that things work and for them as things go along, right? So you want to make sure that it doesn't change over time and that it is like an API. In order to test your component test harness, you're going to want to follow this pattern called a test host. Now I'm going to walk through how to do that really fast, but if you haven't done so before, I do have my entire project available on GitHub that you can take a look at and inspect a little bit later if you'd like. So to create a test host, you're going to create a component within the scope of tests. So we're going to call this component add ComponentHarness test. Notice that it doesn't have the component prefix in this case, and we're going to just follow what Angular suggests for this. And then we are going to bring in the app add comment component, which is the component for which we've written the test harness for. We need to bring this in so we can start testing against it. Next, we can set up our test bed. In our test bed, we are going to create the component fixture for the test host and declare both the test host as well as the original commenting component. And we'll create the harness loader. So with all that set up, now we can start testing our test harness that we wrote by writing tests against it using that harness loader and then asserting that it works as we expect. In our example, we had just that one element, right? So it was pretty streamlined. However, the component harness locator methods can scale to whatever complexity your component requires. In addition to the locator for method that we used, there's also a locator for all that'll return all elements of a particular type, as well as locator for optional if you have any conditional elements within your component. And in addition to passing in a CSS selector as your selector, you can also pass in other test harnesses as your selector, which allows you to create much more larger HTML fragment test harnesses, and it can really scale to whatever view that you want for your application. And that's particularly helpful if you're writing EDE tests. But just remember, because you can do that doesn't mean you should, right? Just in general, whenever you write components, small is winning. The smaller your components are, not only is it following better architectural practices, but it's also going to make it easier for you to write tests and write test harnesses for. So we have some recipes for success. You want to use test harnesses to keep your UI testing cleaner and easier to maintain. And use test harnesses anytime you're working with Angular material components, which you might as well, it's already there. You want to write test harnesses for any shared components you have within your application, which will make it easier for consumers of that shared component to have their own tests around themselves. But don't forget to test your test harnesses and treat it like the API that it is. You can check out my code. It's available on GitHub. I have this entire project with tests with and without harnesses, as well as that custom harness implementation and tests around that as well. It's all there. You can also check out my slides if you like. This is hosted online, so you can get back to these resources. And if you want to dig in a little bit deeper, I also have a multi-series post about using test harnesses that you can check out. And finally, feel free to reach out to me at Alisa Duncan if you want to chat, if you have any questions. I love chatting with members of the Angular community. I also have really cute Star Wars theme authentication stickers from Okta that I brought with me, so you can feel free to hit me up outside if you're interested in that, or if you just want to talk about auth in general, would love to. And finally, maybe the most important reason to reach out to me, if you have any suggestions for K-dramas, let me know. All right, thank you very much.